Imagine you're sitting in a grand theater. You're watching this massive, high-stakes stage production, and you have the absolute best seat in the house.
Oh man, I love a good front row seat.
Right. And the lighting is flawless, the set design is gorgeous, but suddenly, right in the middle of the most critical act, one of the lead actors just goes completely off script.
Like they just start improvising.
Worse, they start shouting terrible, cruel things at the other actors. I mean, they steal a prop, they knock over the scenery, ruin the entire scene, and then just storm off the stage in a rage.
Yikes. Yeah, sitting there in the audience, you'd think to yourself, well, the director has completely lost control of this show.
Yeah, you'd think it's a total disaster. But then, somehow you manage to get a look at the director's private master script. And you see that every single improvised mistake, every cruel word, every piece of knocked over scenery, well, it was written right there in the margins before the curtain ever went up.
Wow. So the actor thought they were rebelling.
Yeah, they thought they were ruining the play, but they were actually playing their part flawlessly, hitting every single mark the director had secretly laid out for them.
Hmm.
And welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are taking a deep dive into some truly challenging source material.
We really are.
Yeah, we're looking at excerpts from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and specifically we're focusing on a section that details how God uses the works of the ungodly, how he bends their minds to carry out his judgments, and, how he does all of this while remaining completely pure from every stain of sin.
It's a heavy topic. But the mission for this deep dive is to unpack a historically difficult theological concept. We are looking at the razor-thin distinction between God's hidden providence and human responsibility.
Right, because we need to comprehend how the author of all things governs even the most wicked deeds in human history without being the author of sin himself. And this is highly relevant to you, the listener.
Absolutely. Understanding who is truly in charge of world events brings so much clarity. It brings peace. It strips away the anxiety of living in a universe that feels like it has been left to random chance.
So true. What is fascinating here is that the tension I just described with that theater analogy, that is the precise tension John Calvin is addressing in this text.
Yeah, we look at the world, we see the chaos, we see the wicked deeds of humanity, and our natural human reasoning just struggles to comprehend how God can be directing these actions without somehow contracting defilement from the transgression.
We assume that if God is involved in a common undertaking with wicked people, he must share in the blame.
Right. And Calvin points out that because this difficulty seems so inexplicable to people, they've devised this distinction between God doing something and God permitting something.
Ah, yes. The whole permission thing.
Yeah. They want to say that Satan and the impious are not under God's direct hand, but rather that God just stands back and allows them to do their worst.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of permission right out of the gate. Because people love the idea of bare permission. I mean, we hear it all the time.
All the time.
Someone says, God didn't cause that tragedy. He just permitted it to happen. But Calvin entirely rejects this concept of bare permission, doesn't he?
He really does. He does not pull any punches here.
Our text notes that many people are alarmed by the apparent absurdity of God using wicked deeds. So, to protect God's reputation, they devise this evasion that God only permits evil but does not actually will it.
Yeah, they want to clear God's justice of any sinister mark by upholding a falsehood. And Calvin says that upholding a falsehood to protect God's justice is just a terrible evasion. God does not need us to lie to protect his reputation.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is. Calvin argues that this bare permission view paints a picture of God sitting in a watchtower, awaiting chance events, leaving his judgments dependent on human will.
A watchtower, so like a passive observer.
Yeah, if you think about the logical conclusion of bare permission, it means God is just up there in the watchtower looking down, wringing his hands, hoping things work out. But the text proves this evasion fails spectacularly.
How so?
Well, Calvin states that men can accomplish nothing except by God's secret command. Whatever humans deliberate, whatever they plan it, is already decreed by his secret direction.
So there are no surprise events for God.
No. If God is the true arbiter of war and peace, and if he holds this position without any exception, then men are not born headlong by blind motion. They are not acting unbeknownst to God, nor are they acting with his passive acquiescence.
I mean, if God isn't just passively letting things happen, that forces us to look at the actual mechanics of how he operates. The text gives us some intense historical examples to shed light on this.
It really does.
Let's start with Job, because this is the classic example people use to argue for permission. People will read the first chapter of Job and say, look, Satan asks for permission. A bare permission to afflict the holy man is added right there in the text.
Yeah, that is the common reading for sure. Satan presents himself before God to receive his commands.
Right.
And the text notes that Satan does this in a different way and with a different end than the holy angels, but he still cannot undertake anything unless God wills it. Satan wants to destroy Job out of pure malice.
But God has a completely different purpose.
Yes. And the critical element Calvin points out is that we must gather that God was the actual author of that trial. Satan and his wicked thieves, the Sabaeans who pillaged Job's property, they were just the ministers of the trial. They were the instruments.
And the proof of this comes directly from Job's own mouth, doesn't it? When the Sabaeans cruelly and impiously pillaged his property, making off with his livestock and ruining his livelihood, Job didn't say, "The Lord permitted Satan to take away my property."
No, he did.
Job rightly recognized the truth when he said, "The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. As it has pleased God, so is it done."
That is a staggering confession from Job. He recognizes that he was divinely stripped of all his property and made a poor man because it pleased God.
He just bypasses the secondary causes entirely.
He does. He bypasses Satan and the Sabaeans and looks straight to the primary cause. Satan desperately tries to drive the holy man insane. The Sabaeans act out of greed and violence. But whatever men or Satan instigate, God holds the key.
He turns their efforts to carry out his judgments.
Right. Job understands that the thieves were fully responsible for their theft, but God was completely sovereign over the entire event.
Let's move to another example from the text, because this one is even more striking to me.
Great.
We have King Ahab. God wills for the false King Ahab to be deceived so that Ahab will go into battle and be killed.
Oh, that scene in the heavenly court is wild.
It is. God asks who will entice Ahab. The devil offers his services, and God sends him with a definite command to be a lying spirit in the mouth of all Ahab's prophets.
And Calvin says that if the blinding and insanity of Ahab is God's judgment, the figment of bare permission vanishes. It would be ridiculous for the judge to only permit what he wills to be done, rather than decreeing it and commanding its execution by his ministers.
That is a crucial distinction. God doesn't just watch Satan volunteer to be a lying spirit and say, well, I'll allow that.
Right. He sends him with a definite command.
Yeah.
He says, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so.
That completely dismantles the watchtower analogy.
It does. A judge does not just passively permit a sentence to be carried out. A judge decrees the sentence and orders the executioner to fulfill it.
And this concept extends to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which the text brings up as the ultimate example of wicked hands carrying out God's precise will. The religious leaders intended to destroy Christ. Pilate and his soldiers complied with the mad desires of the crowds.
Yes.
Yet the source points out that the disciples, in solemn prayer in Acts chapter 4, confessed that all the impious ones had done nothing except what the hand and plan of God had decreed.
We really have to pause and think about the weight of that prayer.
Yeah.
The disciples are praying shortly after their Lord was brutally murdered. And they do not pray, Lord, we are so sorry that you permitted this awful tragedy.
No, they did whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
Right. They recognized that Pilate, Herod, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel were fulfilling a divine decree. Peter preached that same message at Pentecost, stating that Christ was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God.
It is as if God, to whom nothing was hidden from the beginning, wittingly and willingly determined what the people carried out.
Yeah. And the source also brings in the Old Testament prophets to back this up. Jeremiah declared that every cruelty the Chaldeans exercised against Judah was God's work.
And Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan, ruthless king, is literally called God's servant in the text.
He is. God proclaims that by his hissing, by the sound of his trumpet, by his authority and command, the impious are aroused to war. The Assyrian Empire is called the rod of God's anger, the axe that he wields with his hand.
The destruction of the holy city and the ruin of the temple are called God's own work.
The language there is incredibly vivid. An axe does not swing itself. A rod does not strike on its own. They are instruments wielded by a hand. When the Assyrians invade, they are acting out of their own imperialistic greed. They want to conquer and destroy. But Isaiah says they are the rod of God's anger. God is using their greedy, violent desires to execute his righteous judgment against a rebellious nation.
Okay, I have all these examples in front of me. Job, Ahab, the crucifixion, Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrians. But I want to push back on this with a specific analogy for you. Let's think about a normal workplace.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a manager permits an employee to break the rules, maybe to embezzle money or harass a coworker, that manager is still negligent. We would hold that manager accountable in a court of law.
Sure.
But Calvin is saying God isn't a negligent manager looking the other way. He is actually writing the script for the employee's actions. So
Well,
how does Calvin justify God decreeing the blinding of men who will soon be punished for that very blindness? If the manager knows the employee is prone to theft and then actively writes a script for them to steal, the manager is completely at fault. Help me understand that gap.
well, the gap exists because we are trying to judge the creator by the standards of a human manager. A human manager is under a higher moral law. The manager and the employee are peers under the law of the state and the law of basic morality.
Right, that makes sense.
But God is not a peer. He's the standard of justice himself. Furthermore, Calvin points out that the human in this scenario is not a neutral party, simply handed a script. In reality, the text shows that God's decree of blindness is itself a just judgment upon a humanity that is already fallen and obstinate.
So you are saying the employee in the analogy is already corrupt, already desiring to embezzle.
Precisely.
Mm.
When David confesses that the curses of Shimei proceeded from God's command, David says, "The Lord commanded him to curse days." David is not murmuring against God. He is recognizing God as the just judge. Yeah. The text states that those who substitute bare permission for God's providence are babbling and talking absurdly. They forget that human will is not some independent variable. When God decrees for an already sinful person to act out their sin in a specific way at a specific time, he is executing a righteous judgment, often to punish another sin.
So God is not creating fresh evil in a neutral heart.
No, he is governing the existing evil in a fallen heart to accomplish his perfect ends.
That immediately forces us to ask a terrifying question. How is he actually pulling the strings inside a human mind without turning us into robots? Because if God is actively decreeing events, we must examine the mechanics of how this impulse occurs within the human mind.
Right.
The text quotes Solomon from Proverbs, stating that the heart of a king is turned about hither and thither at God's pleasure. Like streams of water, God directs it wherever he pleases. And that principle applies to the entire human race, doesn't it?
It does. The source notes that Solomon's statement carries as much weight as saying whatever we conceive of in our minds is directed to his own end by God's secret inspiration.
That is huge.
It is. The text is very clear that God works inwardly in men's minds. It is not just an external orchestration of circumstances. Unless God worked inwardly, it would not be said that he removes speech from the truthful, or takes away the heart of princes so they wander in trackless wastes, or strikes men with dizziness or drowsiness.
The sleep of God overtaking Saul's camp is such a vivid illustration of this. David sneaks into King Saul's camp, takes Saul's steer and water jug right from near his head, and nobody wakes up.
Nobody at all.
The text says a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. God inwardly worked drowsiness into the minds of all those soldiers. But then Calvin goes into some much darker territory. He points out passages where God blinds men's minds, smites them with dizziness, makes them drunk with the spirit of drowsiness, casts madness upon them, and hardens their hearts.
And Calvin anticipates the objection here, which is the same objection we started with. He says some might try to claim these instances also refer to divine permission, as if God simply forsakes the wicked and allows them to be blinded by Satan.
But Calvin doesn't buy that.
Not at all. Calvin calls that solution too absurd because the Spirit clearly expresses that blindness and insanity are inflicted as God's just judgment. It is not a passive forsaking, it is an active infliction. When God gives someone over to a reprobate mind, it is a judicial act.
We have to talk about Pharaoh. Whenever this topic comes up, Pharaoh is the ultimate case study for hardened hearts.
Oh, absolutely.
The text states God is the cause of Pharaoh's hardened heart. God says, I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. God made it heavy, God stiffened it. Now, people try to get around this tension by pointing out that in other chapters it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot.
Right. They use that to argue that God was just responding to Pharaoh. But Calvin says these two statements perfectly agree. Man is acted upon by God, yet at the same time himself acts.
This is a vital distinction in the text, and it is where we really get into the mechanics of what is happening. If to harden signifies bare permission, then the very prompting to obstinacy would not properly exist in Pharaoh as a judgment from God.
It would just be Pharaoh on his own.
Right. Calvin asks how weak and foolish it would be to interpret this as if Pharaoh only suffered himself to be hardened. Scripture says, I will restrain his heart. We see the same language concerning the Canaanites. Moses said they came out to battle against Israel because God stiffened their hearts.
Yeah, and God commands the Assyrians to take spoil and seize plunder, bending them to execute his judgments as if the commands were graven on their hearts. They are impelled by God's sure determination. But wait, you are telling me Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but God also hardened it?
Yes.
That is an incredible tension. I want you, the listener, to do a quick thought exercise. Have you ever made a completely free choice, maybe taking a specific job or deciding to move to a new city or even just picking a restaurant for dinner? You felt entirely in control.
Oh, for sure.
But then you look back months or years later and you see how every single variable was perfectly orchestrated for you to make that choice. The timing, your mood, the advice of a friend, all of it lined up perfectly. You felt you were acting freely, but in hindsight, the path was completely set. So I have to ask you, looking at this text, how can a person be acted upon by God while simultaneously acting themselves? Are we just meat robots?
We are absolutely not robots. And the reason we are not robots is because we have desires. A robot has no will. It has no lust, no pride, no greed. It just executes code.
That makes sense.
The source material addresses this by acknowledging the intervention of Satan as an instrument, but always an instrument under God's impulsion. Satan performs his part, advancing only as far as he is allowed.
Like with King Saul.
Yes, take
Oh.
King Saul, for example. The text says, an evil spirit troubles Saul, but it also explicitly states that this evil spirit came from God. This tells us that Saul's madness proceeds from God's just vengeance. Satan blinds the minds of unbelievers, but the working of error flows from God himself to make those believe lies who refuse to obey the truth.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanics of this. The person acting, whether it is Pharaoh or Saul or the unbeliever, is acting according to their own base desires. They are choosing what they want in that moment. Pharaoh wanted to keep his slave labor. Saul wanted to destroy David out of jealousy.
Yes, they are acting voluntarily. They are not being against their will to do something they hate. They are doing what their sinful hearts desire to do.
But God is involved.
He is. God is the one who has righteously given them over to those desires, actively using their own sinful choices to accomplish his determined plan. He governs the situation, the timing, and the inward working of their minds so that their voluntary sinful choices perfectly align with his sovereign decree.
That is wild to think about.
It is. God gives men up to an evil mind and casts them into base desires because he is the chief author of his own just vengeance, while Satan, or the human's own flesh, is the minister of it.
If God orchestrates even the hardening of hearts, this leads us to a massive logical dilemma. Does God have two conflicting wills? Because on one hand, he gives a moral law. He forbids certain actions. He tells Pharaoh, let my people go.
Right.
On the other hand, he decrees that men will break that very law. He decrees that Pharaoh will not let the people go. We have to look at the nature of God's will itself.
And Calvin tackles this objection head-on. The objection is that if nothing happens apart from God's will, there must be two contrary wills in him, because by his secret plan, he decrees what he has openly forbidden by his law.
But Calvin disagrees.
Radically. The source text makes it crystal clear that God's will is a unity. It is one and simple in him. It only appears manifold or multiform to us because of our mental incapacity.
Calvin uses some very strong language for people who refuse to accept this. The text mentions those who do not hesitate to brand the heavenly oracles with sinister marks of ignominy. Let's pause and translate that.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
Ignominy means public shame or disgrace. Heavenly oracles refers to the scriptures. So Calvin is talking about people who read these tough verses about God's sovereignty and basically accuse the Bible of making God look evil. Calvin talks about people who oppose God's authority with a dismissive little phrase like, to me it seems otherwise, or I do not want to touch upon this.
Yeah, he has no patience for that.
He says they are openly cursing, frothing, and snarling against this doctrine, essentially spitting at the sky.
It is a vivid image. Spitting at the sky does not hurt the sky, it just falls back on your own face. Their blasphemies do not reach God. God dispels their clouds of calumnies, which means their slanderous lies, and makes his own righteousness shine forth.
So the attack isn't really against Calvin.
No, the source is clear that this objection about two contrary wills is not hurled against Calvin, but against the Holy Spirit, who put this confession in the mouth of Job and the writings of the prophets.
That elevates the stakes considerably.
It does. God is the author of all the things that fault-finders claim happen only by his indolent permission. He creates light and darkness. He forms good and bad. Nothing evil happens that he himself has not done in the sense of decreeing it.
The text asks a highly pointed question. Does God exercise his judgments willingly or unwillingly? It brings us back to the crucifixion. When Herod and Pilate conspired to crucify Christ, they did what God's hand and plan had decreed.
Right.
If Christ had not been crucified according to God's will, whence would we have redemption?
That is the absolute proof right there. If God did not will the crucifixion, we would not have redemption.
We would be lost.
But God's will is not at war with itself. He does not change his mind. He does not pretend not to will what he wills.
It is all unified.
Yes. Our text says that because God's wisdom appears multiform to us, we should not dream that there is any variation in God himself, as if he changes his plan or disagrees with himself. When we do not grasp how God wills something to take place that he forbids, we must recall our own sluggish understanding. The light in which God dwells is unapproachable because it is overspread with darkness to our eyes.
To help our sluggish understanding, the source text brings in a brilliant illustration from Augustine. I want to give this analogy some serious breathing room because it is vital for understanding the intersection of human and divine wills.
It's a fantastic analogy.
So Augustine says to imagine a father on his deathbed. He is very sick. This father has two sons. One is a good son and one is a bad son. The good son loves his father. He wills that his father live. He desires his father's health.
Which is the moral thing to do.
Right. But God, in his hidden sovereign decree, wills for the father to die. It is the man's time. Then you have the bad son. The bad son hates his father. He wants his inheritance early, so he wills for his father to die. And God also wills for the father to die.
This is such a brilliant way to break it down. Look at the alignment of the wills here. The good son wills what God does not will. The good son wants life. God decrees death.
Okay, yes.
The bad son wills what God does. Will they both desire the death of the father? Yet, Augustine says the good son's piety, even though he wills something other than what God's secret plan entails, is more consonant with God's good will than the bad son's impiety, even though the bad son wills the same outcome as God.
That is a massive realization for the listener. The good son's will opposes the secret decree of God, but it honors the moral law of God, which commands us to love and care for our parents.
Exactly. I mean, that is spot on.
And the bad son's will aligns with the secret decree of God, the father's death, but it violently breaks the moral law of God because he is acting out of greed and malice.
This raises an essential point about the difference between what is fitting for man to will and what is fitting for God to will. The standard for man is not to guess God's secret decrees. We are not supposed to figure out the hidden script.
Right, that's not our job.
No, our standard is to obey his moral law. The good son acts in accordance with the moral duty of a child. The bad son violates that moral duty out of greed. Through the bad wills of evil men, God fulfills what he righteously wills. As Augustine exclaims, nothing is done without God's will, not even that which is against his will. He willingly permits evil, and here he uses permit in the sense of actively decreeing its existence because, being almighty, he can make good out of it.
Think about your own actions right now. You can want the right thing, you can act purely out of love and obedience, and you might actually be disagreeing with God's hidden plan for a situation. Imagine praying desperately for someone to be healed when God has decreed it is their time to pass.
Yeah, that happens all the time.
You are willing something opposite to God's decree, and you are still doing the right thing. Your moral goodness remains intact. But let me challenge you on this unity of will. We have established that God's will is singular. How does this reconcile with God complaining in the book of Hosea, chapter 8, verse 4, that a kingdom was established without his knowledge? If his will is unified and he decrees all things, how can a kingdom be established without him knowing about it?
That is the very text Calvin brings up to demonstrate the absolute necessity of distinguishing between God's precept and his secret providence. The text in Hosea points out that the kingdom of Jeroboam was set up against God's will. God says, they made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not.
Yeah, that seems like a contradiction.
Yet elsewhere in Scripture, God proclaims that in his anger he gave them King Jeroboam. We know God willed him to be anointed. A prophet literally told Jeroboam it was going to happen. How do these statements agree?
Right, how can he say I knew it not when he sent a prophet to announce it?
The text explains that the people could not revolt from the house of David without shaking off the divinely imposed yoke. That rebellion was a sin. It broke God's law. In that sense, it was done without God's approval or moral sanction. That is what I knew it not means. He did not approve of their rebellious hearts.
Ah, I see.
But God himself was not deprived of the freedom to punish Solomon for his ungratefulness by dividing the kingdom. God does not will a breach of faith, yet with another end in view, he justly wills defection. He decreed the defection to punish Solomon, but he condemned the people because they did it out of sinful rebellion.
Which brings us to the final, most pressing dilemma. If God willed the defection, if he decreed a wicked action, why is the human held guilty? We have reached the climax of this theological issue. How can God justly judge humans who are fulfilling his secret decrees?
The answer lies in the crucial distinction we just touched upon. God's will must not be confused with his precept, which is his moral command. God uses the work of the ungodly, and he governs their plans and intentions, but he is not the author of wickedness.
That is a fine line, but a vital one.
The text insists that men are not undeservedly damned for carrying out what God has decreed, because they are not acting out of obedience to his decree. They do not even know his decree. They are acting out of their own lust. They deliberately break his precept.
Let's look at the historical examples the text provides for this distinction, because they are quite graphic.
Yeah.
First, Absalom and David. Absalom committed adultery with his father David's wives on the roof of the palace in broad daylight. It was a shameful, incestuous act meant to assert dominance.
Very shameful.
Now, earlier, God had told David through the prophet Nathan that because of David's sin with Bathsheba, God would take David's wives and give them to his neighbor in broad daylight. The text says God willed to punish David's own adultery by means of this shameful act. Yet God did not bid the wicked son to commit incest.
Yes. When David recognizes that Shimei is cursing him at God's command, another example from David's life, David does not commend Shimei's obedience. Shimei isn't obeying God. Shimei is just being an impudent dog acting on his own malice.
He hates David and wants to kick him while he is down.
Right. David recognizes the tongue of Shimei as a scourge of God and patiently bears the chastisement. God accomplishes through the wicked what he has decreed by his secret judgment, but the wicked are not excusable. They haven't obeyed a precept. They have deliberately broken it out of their own lust.
So the judgment is based on the heart.
The standard of divine judgment is not just looking at the outcome. God examines what men will to do. He takes purpose and intent into account.
The Jeroboam situation we talked about highlights this perfectly. The people's rebellion against the house of David was sinful. It was a breach of faith. They perverted the order sanctioned by God, yet the beginning of the separation came from the will of the same God. A prophet actually stirred Jeroboam up with a sacred anointing.
Yeah, that is a wild detail.
It was not done without the knowledge of God in the sense of his providence. God commanded it. The 10 tribes were estranged from Solomon's son by God's will to punish Solomon. But the rebellion of the people is rightly condemned because, against God's will, his moral law, they revolted.
And we see another clear example with Jehu and the sons of King Ahab. Jehu, with the help of the citizens of Samaria, murdered Ahab's posterity and exterminated his line. Jehu rightly reported that nothing of God's words had fallen to the ground. He fulfilled what God had said through the prophet Elijah.
But it wasn't a righteous act in his heart, was it?
No, and yet God rebukes the citizens who gave assistance. Why? Because they conspired against their master. They participated in the execution of God's judgment, but they did it with bad motives. In the same act where man's evil deed shows itself, God's justice shines forth.
It all comes down to intent. The text brings Augustine back in to talk about Judas. The Father delivered up the Son, Christ delivered up his own body, Judas delivered up his Lord. Why, in this same event of delivering up, is God just and man guilty?
That is the real question.
Because the cause of their doing it is not one. God willed it for redemption. Judas willed it for betrayal. The text says it is no more right to ascribe the guilt of the crime to God than it is to transfer the credit for redemption to Judas.
That is the crux of the matter. God does not inquire into what men have been able to do or what they have actually done, but what they willed to do. Purpose and will are taken into account in God's judgment seat. When Judas betrayed Christ, he was not thinking about redeeming humanity.
No, not at all.
He was not thinking about fulfilling prophecy. He was thinking about 30 pieces of silver. His will was entirely corrupt, even while his corrupt action was being utilized by God's flawless decree to bring about salvation. The human is judged based on their corrupt intent, not the end result.
I think of it this way. Imagine a reckless driver on the highway. They are consumed by their own selfishness, running late, angry at the world. They illegally drive on the shoulder to cut you off. Their intent is completely selfish. They just want to get ahead.
We've all seen that guy.
Right. Now God, in his hidden providence, determines to leave them to their own pride at that precise moment. He actively orchestrates the variables, the timing of the light, the placement of the cars, so that this driver's selfish choice intersects with your path, cutting you off and delaying you by 10 seconds.
Okay, I follow.
That 10-second delay keeps you out of a massive, fatal pileup a mile down the road. That reckless driver is completely guilty of breaking the law and endangering others. They can be justly ticketed by a police officer because their heart was left to its own selfish desires. They broke the moral law. But God is completely righteous in using their sinful will to accomplish his perfect plan for your protection. His hidden providence is unblemished by their traffic violation.
That is a very helpful modern equivalent. It preserves both the absolute sovereignty of God in timing the event and the absolute guilt of the driver based on their wicked intent. And Calvin concludes this section with an admonition about our attitude toward these truths.
Yeah, he has some strong words about that.
He says that if these things seem harsh, we must consider how bearable our squeamishness is when we refuse something attested by clear scriptural proofs just because it exceeds our mental capacity. God judged it useful for men to know this, which is why he bid his prophets and apostles to teach it. Calvin says our wisdom ought to be nothing else than to embrace this with humble teachableness.
What does Calvin mean when he says our wisdom ought to be nothing else than to embrace this with humble teachableness? It seems like he is drawing a line in the sand regarding how we interact with difficult texts.
He is absolutely drawing a line. Those who scoff at these concepts, who complain that it makes God the author of sin, despite all the textual evidence to the contrary, are prating against God. They are speaking nonsense. They are not worthy of a longer refutation.
Just completely dismissing them.
Yeah. Humble teachableness means recognizing the limits of human reason. It means accepting that God's ways are higher than our ways, and that his justice is not measured by a human ruler. We must embrace what is taught in Scripture without finding fault, recognizing that God's sovereign control over the universe, including the actions of the ungodly, is a doctrine intended to produce awe and reverence, not cynical skepticism.
That brings us to our wrap-up. Let's recap the core findings of our deep dive into Calvin's Institutes. We started by dismantling the myth of bare permission. God's providence is not a passive watchtower observation.
Right. He's not just watching.
He does not just let things happen while hoping for the best. He actively decrees and bends the wills of all people, including the wicked, to execute his just judgments. He does this through inward working, sometimes blinding minds or sending a spirit of error as a just punishment for previous rebellion.
And we saw that with Saul and Pharaoh.
Yes. Yet, because his will is unified, and because humans always act voluntarily from their own sinful desires and intentions breaking, his moral precept God remains completely pure from every stain of sin. Humans remain fully responsible for the wicked motives of their own hearts, just like Judas was responsible for his betrayal, even though it led to our redemption.
And this is where the relevance of this doctrine truly anchors the soul. When you look out at world events, when you face personal trials that seem unjust, chaotic, or driven by the malice of others, you do not have to view them as evidence that God has lost control.
That is a massive comfort.
It really is. He has not taken his hands off the steering wheel. He holds the key. He turns the efforts of the ungodly to carry out his flawless plans. The anxiety of random chance is replaced with the assurance of sovereign providence. Even when you cannot see the mechanics of how he is doing it, you can trust the character of the director.
To you, our listener, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over based on this text. We've spent this entire time talking about how God so flawlessly uses the bad intentions of the wicked to achieve his perfect good. But turn that around for a second.
Oh, this is good.
Think about your own life. How might God be utilizing your own flawed, imperfect good intentions the times you genuinely tried to do the right thing, to help someone, to fix a situation, but you failed miserably in ways you cannot possibly foresee?
Wow.
If he can use the malice of a Judas for the salvation of the world, what is he doing with your earnest, albeit fumbling, attempts at obedience?
That is a staggering thought. It reorients our entire perspective on success and failure. It means our faithful attempts are never wasted, even when they don't produce the outcome we intended.
It really does. It brings us right back to that theater. You might feel like the actor who just tripped over a prop and ruined the scene.
Yeah, I felt like that.
But the director is still in the chair. The script is still in his hands. And the final curtain will reveal that every movement was part of a masterpiece you couldn't see from the stage. Thanks for joining us on Reformed Thinking. We will catch you on the next Deep Dive.